At the scene of any crime, some sort of clue is left behind. They might be minuscule, but they usually point to the culprit. What if the clues, though, don't lead anywhere? Or what if they lead to so many different possibilities that it's impossible to solve? That would mean the perp gets away. Is there really such a thing as a perfect crime? The new limited docu-series on Netflix takes a look at just that. During Germany's reunification in the early 1990s, the man responsible for the economic reconstruction and strategy of the country is assassinated. And to this day, the case remains unsolved. Detlev Rohwedder was killed in his apartment in a seemingly perfect crime. There were some clues left at the scene, but they weren't definitive, and they just really led to more questions. This is a 4-part docu-series, and each of the episodes is about 40 minutes long. As an American, I don't really remember seeing a lot of the information that they are presenting in this doc at the time that it was happening. I remember the wall coming down. I remember these celebrations being splashed across the news. I even remember it being touted as a win for democracy and a blow to communism. What I don't remember, though, is all of the protests, all of the rising up of massive amounts of people to show how unhappy they were at the collapse of their economy and their socialist lifestyle, and even the loss of their jobs. I mean, there are massive protests going on during this time of reunification. As the documentary examines the murder, it paints a really good picture of the political, social, and economic climate in Germany, both before and after the reunification. It was eye-opening to me to hear from people who had lived their entire life in East Germany now bemoan the fact that instead of 2 types of yogurt to choose from at the store, they had like 15. And I understand that might seem trivial, but as capitalism came in, it also affected the economic lifestyle of all of the people in East Germany. And the documentary really dives into some of that because that provides the impetus and some of the motivations, at least they believe, for the murder of Rohwedder. I mean, you have tons of businesses being shuttered, people just losing their jobs in massive numbers, and so the jobless rate is just climbing and climbing. The documentary also explains that unbeknownst to most East Germans, the country was on the brink of a total economic collapse. So in the eyes of the West Germans, this reunification and this influx of money and capitalism was a huge positive thing. So it is crazy to hear the perspectives of both people on different sides of the same issue. We also hear their points of view on topics that have nothing to do with the murder. But you can see how all of that builds the climate in which this happens. The documentary spends a good amount of time building the case around several parties who might be responsible for the death. I mean, all of the theories are pretty sound and they make a compelling argument, but they each also have some holes. One thing that really bugged me, and you could chalk it up to a conspiratorial type of thinking, is that there was, at least to me, one other obvious choice of perpetrator. And the documentary didn't really examine it. It did barely touch on it in the last episode, but no real time was spent investigating that avenue. Now, I got a funny feeling from one of the interviewees in the very first episode by something that they said and just a couple of their mannerisms and even the sureness of some of their beliefs and their assertions that to me, it stood out. And again, that could just be a whole conspiracy thing in my head of like, oh, well, you know, I lean towards this way. But it seemed like that should at least be an obvious point of questioning as well. Now, I know you're just scratching your head going, but you haven't said what that group is. Well, I'm going to leave that to you to figure out as you watch it. I think this is going to please a lot of different audiences. I mean, there's those of you that like history, those of you that like true crime, those of you that like economics, and even those that are into conspiracies. This dives into each of those and provides some fun content. Love that we get a lot of interviews and news footage, so it really helps to build a good narrative around the story and this case. It becomes very engaging. And there are some reenactments, but luckily there's no dialogue to go along with the reenactments, and that tends to make it pretty cheesy. This is just some actors acting out and some action as we're hearing about it from interviewees or news footage or just theories that are going on of this is how it could have happened. Now, overall, this does have a bit of a sad tone to it, and not only because the case is still unsolved and so the family doesn't have full closure yet, but also just hearing the stories of the German people and just how this reunification, while positive in some aspects, was negative in others. And truly, history is the true gauge of how well it actually worked. I do think this is a great docuseries to check out, and it's a pretty quick watch. There's no sex, some brief nudity, some profanity, and some descriptions of violence. Did you hear about this case when it happened? I'm curious if I was just oblivious to it or if it actually did make international news. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.